There's something most people don't realize about communication. We spend a lot of time focusing on how to say things better, how to explain ourselves more clearly, how to make sure the other person understands us. But very few people stop and ask a different question. What if the reason we're not being understood has something to do with how we're listening? Because in most conversations, especially difficult ones, we're not actually listening to understand. We're listening to respond. We're listening to defend. We're listening for the moment where we can jump back in and clarify our point. And when both people are doing that, nobody feels heard. And when people don't feel heard, they stop being receptive. Today I want to talk about why being understood doesn't start with what you say. It starts with how you listen. Hello and welcome to Thrive Within. I'm your host, Marc Bucksouth, a life coach, educator, and someone who's passionate about helping you live more fully, honestly, and aligned with who you really are. This podcast is your space for real talk and focused coaching on things like confidence, purpose, boundaries, self-doubt, and personal growth. So whether you're going to walk, taking a break, or just giving your brain a moment to breathe, I am so glad you're here. Let's get into it. Most people think they're good listeners. But if we're honest, a lot of the time, we're not actually listening. We're waiting. Waiting for our turn. Waiting for the other person to pause. Waiting for the opening where we can jump back in and say what we need to say. And while that's happening, something important is getting missed. We're not fully taking in what the other person is actually trying to communicate. Not just the words, but the meaning, the emotion behind it, the intent. And when that gets missed, the response we give, even if it's logical, it can feel disconnected. And that's when people start to feel unheard. Here's something important. When someone feels unheard, it doesn't just feel like a communication issue. It feels like disrespect. Not because the other person is intentionally being disrespectful, but because being heard is deeply tied to feeling valued. If someone is talking and they feel like you're not really taking it in, or you're already preparing your response, they feel dismissed, even if that's not your intention. And once someone feels that way, their openness starts to close. Now, they're not just talking anymore, they're defending themselves. Here's a simple shift that changes everything. Instead of listening to respond, start listening to understand. And I know that sounds simple, but simple isn't always easy, because it requires you to stay present even when you disagree. It requires you to hold back your response just for a moment. It requires you to care more about understanding their perspective than proving your own. And when you do that, something powerful happens. The other person feels it, and they feel that difference immediately. So let's bring this into a really real moment. You're in a conversation with somebody, and they say something that you just don't agree with. Maybe it even feels inaccurate. And your instinct is to jump in and correct it, to explain your side and make sure that they understand you. But instead, you pause. And you ask something simple. Can you walk me through what you meant by that? Now, instead of interrupting the flow, you just open the door. And as they explain, you're not just waiting to respond. You're actually listening. And when they're done, something interesting happens. They're more open to hearing you. Why? Because they felt heard first. There's another layer to this, and that shows up more in more difficult conversations. It's one thing to listen when you agree, but it's a completely different thing to listen when you don't. Because when you disagree, your mind starts building response almost immediately. You start organizing your thoughts, you start preparing your counterpoint, and you start thinking about how you're going to explain your side. And in that process, your attention shifts away from the other person. You're no longer fully present. You're partially listening and you're partially preparing. But here's the challenge. If someone feels like they're not fully with them, they feel it. And when that happens, they'll either repeat themselves or they raise their intensity. Not because they're trying to argue, but because they're trying to be heard. And that's where conversations begin to escalate. When you stay present, even when you disagree, you change the dynamic. You don't have to agree. You don't have to validate everything being said, but you can understand it. And understanding someone doesn't weaken your position. It strengthens the conversation. And believe me, this takes discipline. Because internally, you might feel the urge to jump in, to correct, to clarify, to defend. And this doesn't go away overnight. But the goal isn't to eliminate that feeling. It's not to let the feeling control your behavior. It's to stay grounded, to stay present, and to choose your response instead of reacting automatically. When people feel heard, everything changes. They become more receptive, more open, more willing to engage, and the conversations become less about winning and more about understanding. And that's where the real connection is built. Not through perfect communication, but through intentional listening. If there's one thing you take away from today, it's this. Being understood doesn't start with what you say. It starts with how you listen. Because when you make someone feel heard, you create the space for them to hear you too. This episode resonated with you, leave a kind review, share it with a friend because it helps more people have conversations like this. Because the more that you trust yourself, the clearer your path becomes. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next episode. And remember, you're doing better than you think.